Okay, welcome to our talk this afternoon. We're delighted to have you, and I hope you'll also join us for our final colloquium of the year on April 29th at 4 o'clock, when Robert Gigier will be presenting on the Bio-CS Bridge, which is a STEM plus C curriculum growing out of his Beecology Citizen Science project. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Zandra Araujo, Chief Equity Officer and Math Principal at the University of Florida's Lastinger Center for Learning. Before starting at the University of Florida, she was faculty at the University of Missouri. And before that, she was a graduate student at the University of Georgia, where she worked on research projects with me and served as my TA for a semester. And when she assured me that she had no interest in becoming a researcher, but instead planned to return to the classroom when she finished her degree. Luckily, she changed her mind. And Zandra has gone on to build a strong research portfolio focused on teachers' curriculum use, particularly with English learners. And her work was recognized in 2020 when she was named the Early Career Award recipient by the Association of Mathematics Teacher Educators. She serves as a board member in NCTM and TODOS and has published a variety of mathematics education journals and created the Mathematically Educated blog and co-created 2-Minute Teacher's Guide to help make research ideas more accessible to teachers. And I am delighted to turn it over to Zandra.
Thanks. I love that you remember that, because I tell people that all the time. I tell my grad students that I was a first generation college student, a first generation American. And when I got my PhD, I just went because I didn't know what else to do. And so I was like, I'm going to go back and teach high school afterward. And Zandra, luckily, let me work on her research grant. Does it work? And I actually started to like it, shockingly, over time. And I haven't left research since then. So it is fun. And I did very much enjoy TAing with Zandra also. So thanks for having me. You can feel free to leave your cameras on or off. It's always nice to see faces, but I understand that it's a Friday afternoon as well. As Zandra said, I'm Zandra. I have a talk today that I kind of put together and pulled from different places. I'm hoping my dogs hold out. It's almost dinner time for them. So they start getting angry and hungry. But I put together some parts from different research projects, so you can kind of get an overview of what I do as a researcher. I've recently changed positions, like Zandra said. So I've been at the University of Florida's Lastinger Center for Learning since September. So it's been not very long in this current role, but feel free to pop questions in the chat. I have 2 monitors, so I'll be able to keep an eye on them, or Zandra or Stephen can ping me if I miss one. And you can also just interrupt me if you have questions along the way. And we'll have time for Q&A extensively afterward as well. All right, so you should be seeing a slide that has an animal on it. Cool. All right, so I'm just curious, does anybody know what this animal is? I mean, put it in the chat if you think you know. You can also just guess. Anybody know what this little guy is, or girl, or person, animal, rather? An ice hamster. I love that, Samantha. That's like a really good guess. Some kind of shrew, a very cute little friend, a hamster. Yeah, so none of those are right, but they're all kind of on the right track. So this cute little animal is a lemming. So I don't know if you've ever heard of a lemming, but if you have, why not put something in the chat what you've heard about lemmings? And if you've never heard of a lemming, that's okay too. Followers, they follow each other. They are followers. The old school computer game, I do not know that one, so we'll have to catch up on that one afterward. Okay, so they're followers. I think that's probably gonna be the common one. So there's this, don't be a lemming is like kind of a popular saying, right? And they're known as followers. And so really, there's this whole lore about Norwegian lemmings, or lemmings overall. And it's this notion that they'll follow each other off of a cliff and commit suicide, essentially, because they're so, passive and they just follow the crowd. So that's kind of like the tale that a lot of people will say, like avoiding, following the crowd. Don't be a lemming. So the reputation of these lemmings, or that they're stupid like other lemmings. They show none of the cunning of other rodents. When overcrowding becomes an issue, they will run for the sea, throwing themselves off cliffs for the good of the species. Lemmings can also explode. People really do believe that. And so none of this is actually true. The reason why that this got perpetuated is there was this old Disney movie called The White Wilderness, which predates me. So it's this, Disneyfication of ecology, I guess. It's like, not Ken Burns or the other guy that does all the Planet Earth, David Attenborough, but it was a Disney kind of version of that. And so there is a scene in this movie where a bunch of lemmings kind of just like march off of a cliff together and plummet to their death. Now, that's where they got this horrible reputation as being dumb and followers and they don't have anything. But actually, they didn't march into the sea. They were tipped in from a truck. So it's pretty terrible. Disney orchestrated the death of lemmings to showcase a perpetuation or a particular vision of what a lemming is. But it's not true, but it's become part of the lore that exists in our society when people say, don't be a lemming. But we know that we shouldn't actually use that saying because that's not true. But that is the narrative that has won from this experience. And so today, I'm going to look at some things in math education and in the research that I've come across or that I've done and how I've re-examined some assumptions that seem to be lore in our field. These are things that I hear teachers say, I say before I learn better, just things that we pass along that we're yes, this is an assumption. We all assume this thing is true. And then some of my research has actually shown quite the opposite. And so making sense of that has been a big part of what I do as a researcher. And so it always reminds me of this story because I think we carry these narratives on without a lot of evidence because we think they're best. But our job as researchers is to really uncover, is that actually based on reality, or is this assumption that we're perpetuating through our own actions and words? Okay. So I'm going to start with a more recent study that I did, and then I'm going to kind of go back, and then I'm going to go to my very current new grant. So the first assumption that a lot of people have is that textbook supports are beneficial. And I'm going to use the term ELL. It's not my favorite English language learner, but it is what most practitioners use. So I tend to use that in my own research. I just had a commentary come out in JARST along with some other folks that talks about the problematic nature of labels and how changing labels doesn't really fix the problem. If you care to look that up, it's very short. It's in response to commentaries on #RetireELL. But the textbooks I examined for this particular study all used ELL, so I'm going to use that term. I do acknowledge that it focuses on deficits, the English learning aspect of students rather than them being multilingual. However, there are a lot of multilingual students that are not classified as English learners. And I'm really talking about students who are classified as English learners in our schools, which is a different type of population. So I'm going to challenge this notion that textbook supports are beneficial for ELLs, or actually this notion was challenged through research that I conducted. But the reason why we build textbooks with supports for ELLs is because we think they're beneficial. Teachers like them when they do textbook adoptions, like the state of Florida is in the midst of a textbook adoption right now. Teachers look for things for ELLs. So my colleague and former student, Erin Smith, and I wanted to find out, what are the learning needs of English learners as communicated through textbooks? So textbooks are very static. They're written by humans. We just wanted to see, if I were a teacher that was using an Algebra 1 textbook and I had English learners in my classroom and I wanted to support them, what kinds of things would the textbooks suggest I do? And what does that in turn suggest that English learners need, or what they're capable of? So we took 4 commercial textbooks. So these are probably about 80% of the market share of Algebra 1 in the country. If you're a math ed person, you will see that these are pretty commercial, traditional textbooks. They're not reformed textbooks like CPM or IMP, but they're the ones that are most commonly used across the country. And we really wanted to know kind of like what's the idea behind what they're suggesting for ELs. If we look through all the algebra supports for ELs in all these textbooks, we would still be doing this analysis right now. It's a lot of stuff. So we had to limit ourselves in some manner. And so Erin and I decided to take some of the bigger topics in algebra that are pretty foundational to the study of algebra and start there. And in particularly, we really honed in on the cognitive demand and deeper questions around the 2 in green, which is solving linear equations, which is a huge part of middle school and high school algebra. We took these textbooks, we bought the teacher's guides, we bought any supplemental materials that existed, which there are a lot of them if you've ever been a teacher that's used one of these programs. And we pulled anything that had tagged for English language learners, so like ELLs. So there's teacher materials, which includes the textbook and the margin notes. And often the margin notes say, for your English learners, try this. There's supplemental guides. Some textbooks have an entire supplemental guide just for English learners. And then there's base programs, which are student-facing materials. And those included the student editions broadly, like for all students. And then they often had supplemental workbooks that were just for English learners or labeled specifically for English learners. So we looked at all these things for those particular topics that I referenced. We kind of, as we looked through them, we drew on the research in English language learners and mathematics, and we kind of like looked for things that we thought would be meaningful and that we thought would show up because research says these things are important. So we looked at how they attended to vocabulary, if so, how the vocabulary was treated. Were students encouraged to use their full linguistic repertoire like L1 and L2 and nonverbal communication? Were there connections to students out of school experiences or culture? What was the cognitive demand of the textbook problems that were given for all students and for English learners in particular? Were there opportunities for students to use discourse to explain their thinking in writing or spoken language? And were there representations like so that the students could make sense of problems and situations with images? So we coded every single thing that we noted in those chapters, looking at these, some other things besides this, but mostly these kind of aspects. So there were some implied needs from looking across all of these materials. So these are our findings. So what did we find in looking across all these things? We found that the textbooks kind of had an implication of the needs for English learners. That's what we were trying to find. And these are the 3 needs that were implied from our analysis. Number 1, they kind of implied that all English learners, no matter what reading level, speaking level, anything, they all just need the same accommodations. Some of this is a limitation of pre-printed materials, but by and large, there was no distinction among different levels of English proficiency. So here's like kind of a sample of some of the supports that we came across. So they would say ELL support, and they would just say, do this, or you might use this. You can see in the top right, it just says English language learners, and it tells you where to reference a teaching tip, and then it says English language learners, so teachers would presumably look there for that information, and then differentiated instruction, and it has tags for approaching level, on level, and English language learner all tagged. So in each of these kinds of situations, there's no, like if your student is brand new to the United States or to English, they should do this. Or if they've recently tested out, but they're still labeled as English learners, they should do this. There's no attention to the various English language level proficiencies. So we know that a lot of states use WIDA, which has 6 levels of English proficiency for students, like presumably an entering student, a student who's at level 1, who's brand new to English, would need different supports, maybe more supports than somebody who's at a level 4 where they're expanding. They might've been in the schooling system for a while in the US, had a lot of exposure. But by and large, we found no evidence that there was attention to different levels of English proficiency. So they were kind of given one size fits all supports, which is not necessarily the best thing. We also know that there's different language skills. So there's receptive skills, so listening or reading, and there's productive skills, speaking and writing. And students can differ greatly in these different skills. So I grew up in a Portuguese household, but not being taught Portuguese explicitly. So I kind of picked up stuff along the way because my parents are immigrants. And so my listening is really good. So I would be at a different level as a listener than a speaker. Speaking is a challenge. I just didn't do it as much. I could answer in English. And so I did. There was no attention to different levels of skills or anything like that, like receptive or productive. It was basically just blanket statements. So that was the first implied need. The second implied need was that English learners require additional practice in mathematics, and that practice should be remedial. So if we think about English learners, they're classified as such because of their language proficiency, not their mathematics proficiency. And so because of that, you wouldn't think that like math is automatically remedial for these students because they like many of them have been in school in their home countries or like, you know, back and forth, whatever. But what we found is that there's a strong narrative that they require remedial support. One of the ways that we studied this and uncovered this is we looked for what was labeled for English learners and what was not labeled for English learners. So this is a listing of all the various resources we found in the books. On the middle column, or the column that says resources indicated for ELLs, those are all the things that had like little ELL bubbles, that labels for them. But they did not have labels for high performing students. It was just like English learners, special education, something like that. They all said English learners, but they didn't say for high performing students. The column on this side, on the right-hand side, were things that were labeled for high performing students. They said this in different ways, like beyond level or like high achieving or advanced learners, but they did not have labels for English learners, okay? So it's kind of sending a message like, these are the kinds of things for English learners because they're explicitly labeled as such. Here's a list of things that's for high performers. And you could say, well, high performers could be English learners, but why wouldn't they label them as such? Like they were distinctly labeled, they were mutually exclusive. So if we look at some of these names for the high performing students, enrichment, find the errors, exclamation point, puzzles, challenge tasks, are you ready? Enrichment, they're like these nice things that we know we want for students. We want students to have experiences with fun things like puzzles and to enrich their learning and be challenged. If you instead look at the other list, it's more like support, reteaching, practice, reading strategies. It's like more remedial kind of resources. And when we dug into the actual content of those tasks, they were different mathematically. So there was lower cognitive demand tasks for English learners than in these other resources as well. So the way that labels work is that even though they're trying to suggest supports, they also are pushing a narrative of what students need or benefit from and what they don't need or aren't ready for. And we found that it was mostly suggesting that ELs need math remediation, not just English remediation. And then finally, there was a strong narrative that ELLs require additional vocabulary practice. So as an English learner in a math class, you would also need to learn vocabulary if you were a native English speaker in a math class, because you're learning the vocabulary in math class. Like, where else would you learn it? I'm not teaching you rhombus on the streets necessarily, right? Like, you come to math class, even if you're here or like in the class, you're going to learn what rhombus is. So it was weird to us, or it was odd to us, or maybe just like it stood out to us, that there was a real push for drilling of vocabulary for English learners in a way that seemed beyond what native English speakers would get, even though it's technical vocabulary that was appropriate for the lessons that were targeted. So they would say things like, here's slope, and they front loaded a lot of the vocabulary for English learners, like slope, here's the definition, here's a whole list of words, and learn it before the chapter. And they did this more for English learners or things tagged English learners than other students. When we know this is not the best way to do it, what you might want to do instead is have students look at two lines and say like, okay, can you talk about the differences of lines? And students will naturally say, well, the blue line's more like this and the red line's more like this. And then you can talk about, well, what does that mean? And eventually somebody in the class is probably going to say, well, it's steeper, or it goes quicker, or something like that. So they're talking about the notion of slope before they have the word for it often. And then you can say like, oh yeah, like, you know, think about mountains and slopes of mountains. Not that all kids know what that is, especially Florida kids. But you can think about those kinds of things. And then you can connect it to the formal term later. And we know this is a much better way to introduce vocabulary and make meaning for mathematical ideas, but this is not what the textbooks did. Instead, they did a lot of drill and pre-teaching of vocabulary, but only for English learners did they really emphasize it in like 6 different resources. So it's perpetuating this notion that they need like very explicit and detached vocabulary instruction. So through all this, it was kind of an interesting narrative that's being pushed. And we thought it was a pretty vicious cycle, because what happens is I, as a teacher, might get this textbook and it's saying that these are the kinds of things that ELL should get because they're labeled as such. So I'm taking this in consciously or unconsciously and saying, oh, they must need like all the same thing. It doesn't matter. I'm not attending to language levels. They must need remediation because those are the kind of problems I'm seeing marked for them. They must need vocabulary practice because there's a lot of it for them. And so then as a teacher, when I go looking for more stuff for other English learners, I look for those kinds of things that I think are appropriate because my official curriculum suggests them. And it makes this really hard to break cycle between like the messages we're getting, and then we kind of take them on intentionally or not. Then we look for stuff that we're familiar with, and then the kids get limited and limited and limited in options and interactions with challenging mathematics that we know they need. So that's the first assumption that I would challenge, is that when we have supports for English learners, it's not always a good thing, actually. We can often marginalize students further by putting out resources that we say are helpful, but actually send the message that students are incapable of other things. And so we have to be really careful with that. Actually, I had a podcast with Sam Otten, the math ed podcast lately, and he asked me, well, what would you do instead? And I said, I'd get rid of any labels for students and instead attend to curricular aims. So I would say, like, if you want to have a good conversation about this, this is what you do. And I wouldn't even label the students, because as soon as we label students, we tend to make them more deficit or like over stereotype and complicate it. So if I were writing a textbook right now, I would focus on aims and goals rather than student groups if I were making suggestions for teachers. And then teachers can get to know their students and do what's best for them instead of over scaffolding everybody. Okay, so that's the first one. The second one is personalized materials are best. So this is an assumption that's pretty prevalent, I would say, amongst my work with teachers. Of course, I would want to personalize things for my students. I don't want to just pull things off the shelf necessarily. I feel like I have to teach my students the way I know best because I know them. So this is a very dominant narrative, but I'll show you one way that we found that I would question that. Whoops. Okay, so this is part of the flipped math study that has recently concluded. We were looking to see what differences we found between flipped and non-flipped teachers' instruction. Flipped being that you send home like materials for students to learn the content and then they practice in class. So the class time is flipped with the homework time. They're getting their lecture, it's usually a lecture, before they do the lesson, and then in class you have more time to do problems together. And we tried to look for student learning outcomes. It was going great. And then COVID hit. So our post-test kind of bit the dust a bit. And it was a very unfortunate end to the study, but we still have a lot of data that we're combing through. We looked at 50 classes. That's not 50 teachers, but it's 50 classes. We looked at 38 teachers. About half were flipped and half were non-flipped. And they were mostly 8th and 9th grade algebra teachers throughout Missouri. We did student pre and post tests. We did 3 lesson observations. We collected all the videos that they used for flipped classes, and we did teacher and student surveys. So when we think about flipped instruction, you have the at-home portion. This is kind of how we're framing flipped instruction. The at-home is that video. It's usually a video. They could do other things. I saw a teacher that did iBooks. She made all these beautiful iBooks and she sent them home, but typically it's just a video that teachers use. They instruct through that video. They could range in time from like a couple of minutes to 30 minutes, which is really long. Then in class, the teachers are typically using like whole class instruction or some voluntary groupings, and the kids are working on problems. And then presumably all this leads to some kind of student learning outcomes. We looked at different types of quality of the videos that they made. So we looked at the mathematical quality. We adapted from various different instruments. So like, was there conceptual development? Were there mathematical representations? Were there math errors, connections? We also looked at the design of the videos using multimedia design principles. And we looked to see if they were interactive, like were there embedded questions? Did they say, pause the video here and then keep going, things like that. And so what we found is that almost all the videos were lecture videos. They almost all were screencasts, and they seldom had interactive elements. Sometimes teachers would embed them with Edpuzzle. So this is like, by and large, they all looked like Khan Academy, let's say, except for, you know, they didn't use the black screen. Sometimes they had better handwriting than Khan does. But by and large, they all kind of mirrored a typical Khan Academy video, which if you haven't seen them, just Google Khan Academy later and you'll kind of see what they look like. So in addition, they all kind of had a similar format. So this was pretty common in terms of the format. They would typically be an introduction. These are the seconds, how many seconds they were. And we did this for every video we watched. So it would have an introduction and be like, today we're doing solving one-step linear equations. It was very brief introduction typically. Then they would define something, a procedure or a math idea. Then they would do a worked example and they would just follow that cycle through a couple of times, typically once, maybe twice. And that's it. So they all kind of look the same. But interestingly, all the teachers made their own videos. So they're all making their own videos. They pretty much all look exactly like the textbook. They just took the textbook and made a video for it. But they all look the same. The only difference was really the narrator. And you didn't even see the narrator because they were screencasts typically. So all of these teachers are spending hours and hours and hours making these lecture videos that kids did not typically watch. We know from the surveys and from the hit counts on YouTube, if you have 20 kids and only 5 views, they're not watching them. But they're spending so much time making these videos that they're not really planning for the in-class time that comes after, which is seemingly just as important because you have a whole group of kids together. You can orchestrate some cool discussions, interactive things, but they're spending all their little prep time making these videos because they felt like they had to teach their kids. And the way they felt like they were teaching their kids is by making these videos. And so everybody's spending hours and hours making these videos that nobody's watching, and they all end up looking the same anyways. And you could have just pilled a Khan Academy video. Not that they're great, but they're just as good as what the teachers were making. So we wrote an MTLT article, and we suggested, like, instead of doing this, maybe like, if you really feel the need, just pick short videos or make a really short video, because kids are probably not going to have the attention span. They pause, they don't watch them. So they need to be small and short. And we know from research, under 10 minutes is great for high school kids. 6 minutes is kind of like the number that gets cited a lot for videos. And so you're not going to, you know, to do a really good 6-minute instructional video takes so much planning. It's not going to be just taking and transforming what you have in your textbook into 6 minutes, like a short, quick video. And teachers don't have that training. I taught methods courses for years. I never taught teachers how to do that. And so, you know, they could just find one that's not too short. They're probably better off. Teachers don't have to make their own videos. They can use existing videos, and often they're better production quality anyways. And we know that that influences students to some extent. It is nice to embed or link to interactive opportunities so that you actually tie in that homework to the class. And you don't have to just do lecture videos. You could set up a nice task and like tomorrow, you know, like a 3-act math task. You could just send them home with the first act to watch, and then you could use that to stimulate a question the next day. So basically these personalized videos, they all look the same. So what's the value of personalization? it does feel good as a teacher that you're instructing your students. And actually I've heard teachers say, parents tell them that they're not teaching because they're sending home videos. But the time investment and the anxiety over making these videos is just not panning out to something that matters. And actually, there was no significant difference in terms of videos among the teachers. Like, we didn't find any ties to videos and learning at all during this study. So like, if you watch the video reported doing homework, like that's correlated, of course, because you're probably like doing the homework and practicing. But the video didn't seem to make any difference in terms of student learning outcomes. And it was relational, it wasn't causal. So I'll give that caution. But my question is, what could teachers do better with this time? Or maybe they're just happier human beings because they're not working as hard and they have more time to be there present with the students the next day. There's a lot of cost to personalization. And so in this instance, personalization might not be best. And there's these other questions too I have, like, are teachers prepared for this? Probably not. Could the time be spent better? I would argue yes. And there is a cost to making your own materials. And if you Google on or search on YouTube for solving linear equations, I'm pretty sure there's at least 20,000 hits of videos, 20,000 other teachers that already made a video. I don't know why we think our next one's going to be the one that really teaches kids, but it's because we feel good about it. So this one is another one. So, and this one perplexed our team and we're still thinking about it, but it seems like changing up your instructional format's important. And actually in mathematics education, we tend to think like whole class discourse, like having orchestrating discourse and like discussions is important. And so I'm going to question what evidence we have for that and what my evidence is showing. So this study looked at not the videos, but the in-class time. And so we were kind of seeing like what matters. We made profiles for teachers' classrooms to try to figure out like, what does it actually look like to teach algebra and what are the various formats? So we kind of made these little icons for segments of class. So we did a whole class format that looks like the teacher with some kids. We did group work. It's the bubbles, the kids without the teacher, and then independent is these solitary ones, and then non-instructional time. So these are kind of the big buckets of like, if I'm a teacher teaching, I'm probably either using whole class or group work or independent work, or kids are off task or announcements are happening or something else is going on. Those are like kind of like the big things we do as teachers in terms of like formats of class instruction. So we took those and we kind of made profiles, visual profiles of what classes tend to look like. So for flipped classrooms, there's a lecture video that's before the actual lesson. Then there might be some non-instructional time, these X's on the top one. So that might be like, I'm taking attendance, the announcements are on, you know, like there's something going on in the classroom. Then I might give a brief recap of the lecture video, answer questions as a whole group. And then I let kids work independently after they're there. So that's like one common profile. And you can think about classes you've seen, you've probably seen that profile. That was a profile I used as a math teacher. Another possible profile is you could give a lecture video. You come together as a whole class and either discuss it, follow up on some things, let the kids work, and then come back as a whole class again at the end. And those whole class times are like where everybody's attending to one speaker, typically, like somebody's orchestrating discourse or helping facilitate the discourse, and the discourse is a public whole group kind of situation. And the third one would be where this is a very common flipped model, actually, where you send home a lecture video or the kids do it in class, and then they just work independently on problems, and the teacher will just pop in as needed for additional help. So with these three kind of formats, which one do you think was correlated with the highest student learning outcomes? Like a model where you kind of have whole group and then independent, you have whole group, you like let the kids work and then you come back together and you work, or one that you like just let the kids work? So which one do you think had like the correlation with student learning outcomes? Option 2, the middle one, 2, 2, 2, the second one, Yeah, so that would be my assumption too. We actually found the third one had the highest student learning outcomes. We had on our advisory board for the flipped project, we were trying to give equal treatment to reform-oriented teaching and traditional teaching. And so we had experts in direct instruction on our project, and they kind of predicted this. And we were like, why are we seeing this? This is so disappointing. Yeah, it's blasphemy, exactly. We actually found that the more whole class you had, and even when it was better in terms of instructional quality, according to our rubrics, the worse it was. Like in terms of, it was like lower, it was correlated lower with lower student learning outcomes. So there's a lot of reasons for this, we think. One reason might be that the kids are passive during these whole class interactions. Even if there is some student talk, discourse, a lot of the students are passive because only one person is usually talking at that time, if it's a whole group discourse. So I think the time that the students are most engaged actively in problems and thinking is probably when they're working on problems. And that's when it tends to be during that independent work time. And so it was really upsetting to us. I'm on the board of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. We definitely like support reform-oriented curriculum and instruction that like would embrace whole class discourse and well orchestrated whole class discourse. So it was really upsetting to see kind of like, you know, that this one won out in the end. And actually our measures kind of included conceptual measures and procedural measures. I will say overall, the conceptual measures were low across the board. Like students have a very underdeveloped understanding of conceptual understanding of algebra, let's say. Procedures are king still to this day, I would say, in our sample set. So you all are raising a lot of good questions that we can go visit. The class sizes ranged from like 2 to 80, I think, because we had interesting like individualized learning classrooms. But this was across the data set. Like when we put all the flipped classrooms, the non-flipped classrooms, we profiled them out with these segments and kind of like looked at correlations of the percentage of class time that was used in different formats. So yeah, it's really interesting to think about, like there is a very prevalent notion in mathematics education that facilitating discourse is going to make an impact, and that's the thing we should do. And I'm not saying that's not true. I'm saying I have evidence that this independent work time was more powerful in this data set, or seemed to be correlated, which seems to suggest it might be more powerful in terms of student learning outcomes. So what's up with that? Like, why is this happening? And do we need more data? Like, how do we, implement this? Is it just that they weren't doing the whole class discourse well? If it's really hard to do whole class discourse well, does that mean that like the bar is so high that nobody's going to get it? So maybe we should try something else. I don't know. I have a lot of questions. So this raised a lot of questions, which brings me to my last study, which is my current study. PD should target ambitious instruction. I think this is an assumption many people in many fields have, that when we're doing professional development, our professional development should aim to transform teachers into ambitious instruction, teachers that can do ambitious instruction. And what I mean is high cognitive demand tasks that are very student-centric and have a lot of good conversations and math talk and discourse happening. Instead of traditional mathematics teaching, which would be very teacher-centric, lecture-based with some independent work time. So that's the distinction I'm making with my colleagues, Sam Otten and Amber Candela. So I would say that a lot of professional development efforts are ambitious in nature. They want teachers to dramatically change the way they teach mathematics. I watched over 100 algebra lessons over the last few years. I saw very little ambitious instruction across the state of Missouri. I saw a lot of traditional teaching. If you go back to like the old TIMS or PISA studies or whatever, and you watch the videos, it was the TIMS studies, you'll see the same kind of instruction that was done is still happening a lot in the US. And I'm not saying everywhere, but I'm saying I watched 100 lessons and across rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas, teachers that I trained in the past, and it was largely traditional teaching. The inertia to remain traditional in education, like in how you teach, is huge. I will say I was a mathematics teacher. The reason I went into mathematics teaching is because I was good at it. I like procedures. I think it's fun to solve the quadratic formula. Like it is, like it's satisfying. It has an endpoint. It's quick. It's fun. I'm good at memorizing. A lot of Zandras exist in mathematics teaching. A lot of us went into mathematics teaching because we were good at math, and the math we were good at is the math that we learned, which is procedural. So then when you ask me to go and teach in a different way, it's very upsetting because you're telling me to do the stuff that I didn't find fun and that I wasn't good at. So you have this audience that's being like true to who they are as people, and you're trying to disrupt their teaching. It's a very hard sell. And I'm talking mostly secondary middle right now, not elementary. Elementary is actually easier to impact, I would say. So a lot of my work as a professional developer is to try to push teachers toward a more reform-oriented vision of mathematics teaching. And they're often hesitant to do so because it's easier to lecture because that's what you enjoy and that's what you've experienced. Our new grant said, okay, well, instead of trying to be ambitious, let's be very unambitious in our aims for PD, which is pretty sacrilegious, I would say, in the field, or it feels like it is. John Starr in 2016 proposed the idea of incremental. He's not the first. I know he's not the first, but he had a nice essay and he said, the idea of incremental approaches to PD is not entirely new. So being modest in your aims is not new. What is new is that incremental change could be explicitly sought as a policy goal rather than a consolation prize that results from incomplete attempts at transformational change. So typically we aim high. I've been on PD grants. I've had a grant that was very ambitious, the Quest grant, and we aim to transform teachers' teaching. And that was elementary science in particular. And what happens often is that it doesn't work and teachers might move the needle for a while, but often it's like, they don't change that much. It's hard to change people. It just is. We have beliefs, we have constraints on our time, things like that. So Starr is saying, okay, instead of trying to be ambitious and just saying like, we didn't get as far as we wanted, but we did make some progress. What if we just state from the onset, my aim is just to make everybody like 10% better instead of making everybody 90% better. Like, I just want to do like a 10% improvement on lots of teachers' practice. I don't want to transform 90%, 10% of the teachers, 90%. I want to do 90% of the teachers, 10%. So would that matter? So this is the whole question underlying this new grant that I have. So we describe our efforts as incremental PD, and our aim is to develop a sustainable and scalable model for modest improvements to teachers' practice. So we're not trying to transform into something totally new. We know teachers do a lot of lecture. They do a lot of independent practice problems with students. So can we give them like just little ways to jazz that up and make that a little bit better? That's the question. In our project, we're taking teachers' constraints as a given. We know teachers don't have a lot of time to plan. So if I give them brand new tasks that they have to develop or plan, it's likely not going to work because it's not sustainable and it doesn't align with the current realities of their classroom. I don't expect teachers to work 80 hours a week. That's ridiculous. I want them to use the time that they have in the most like meaningful way possible. And so whatever their constraints are, they don't have money, they don't have a curriculum that they like, they don't have access to whatever. I'm going to take those as givens in my model. Instead of saying, this is why it didn't work, I'm going to say, I need to build something that works within those constraints. I'm also going to work with teachers' current practice. So whatever they're doing, I'm going to look at ubiquitous or nearly ubiquitous aspects of teachers' instruction. So in watching all those algebra lessons and talking with many teachers, we know that every teacher at some point is going to direct instruct in algebra. I mean, it's really hard to get around it. So direct instruction is pretty common. Giving homework problems, almost every single teacher gives homework problems at some point or independent work. So that is something that I can use as a starting point to try to like incrementally improve. If you're all doing homework and all going over homework, what's like a couple ways I can suggest that you can do that a little bit better? And by better, we're meaning leads to better student learning outcomes in terms of conceptual understanding in particular, and also enjoyment of algebra, which is woefully not high, let's say. And so the way we're going to do this is our hypothesis, is that we're going to think about high uptake practices. Rather than ambitious practices or high leverage practices, we're going to focus on what we're calling high uptake practices. So this is a term that we've been using and we're trying to define right now. So high uptake practices are kind of something that we have to define after the fact. So our idea is, what are those things that stick, that teachers tend to do and that they can implement in different arenas? So it's got to be a specific action that can be implemented without delay. There can't be a big learning curve if it's going to be a high uptake practice, because that would preclude it from being high uptake. Something that teachers could share, say like, oh, I heard this thing, it's really cool. It's a small thing that I've been doing and it's really helped. It needs to be close to their current practice. Like I said, if a teacher does not do any high cognitive man tasks, and your whole thing is now you have to do a high cognitive man task, I would say that's very ambitious, actually. So that's too big for what we're proposing. So just to get the scale of things. And then these high uptake practices should be a meaningful change that aligns with teachers' underlying goals. So if a teacher is really like, I really want to get my kids more engaged, then maybe these nudges, these high uptake practices that we're proposing or might suggest to a teacher would be things that we think, based on literature and stuff, might nudge them toward higher student engagement. And we'll look for evidence of that in our videos. So right now we are getting baseline data from teachers about their current practice. We're going to videotape the lessons. We're going to create modules for teachers around these nudges or potential high uptake practices. And then we're going to see, do we see evidence of them trying them out? And do we see any correlations with any student learning outcomes? They may be, it's challenging because the changes might be so small, they're not enough to nudge or to see on pre-post tests, or we might not be able to see them in action unless we're really sure what we're looking for. But the hope is that we might see when teachers like find things that work, and work being aligned to their goals and things, that they might accumulate to bigger changes over time, or maybe not. Maybe it's just a little bit better for them and their students every day. We're not sure if we'll be able to capture it. Most of the tools that have been designed, most of the things we know about professional development have had an underlying assumption that we're working toward ambitious change. So we actually don't know a lot about, like, do those things also hold if we're only looking for very modest changes to teachers' practice? So it'll be an exciting study. I don't know what we're going to find, which is why it's interesting. I like doing research where you don't know what the outcome is going to be. That's more exciting. But the question is, should PD target ambitious instruction? I think that's the assumption that our field has, but I'm going to challenge it and say, like, maybe not. Let's take Star at his word and see what it looks like to build PD that's very incremental and modest in its aims. Okay, I shared those 4 assumptions with you. There's a lot of other ones in our field. Sometimes we just say things and there's actually little evidence to back up what we're saying, but it feels like it works, and it might indeed work. And some of my assumptions might actually be proven true over time, and that's fine. But the point is, we need to be systematic and get some evidence behind it, because, like it or not, policymakers need evidence behind what they're suggesting. They do come to us at my current job and they say, like, we want something that works. And I have to share with them data that shows that it works. If I just say, like, I feel like it works, they're not going to put it into policy. They're not going to fund initiatives. So we really need evidence to back up the things that we're saying. And honestly, we need more big evidence and RCT evidence, because people like to quote and use those to buttress their funding initiatives. So my proposition is that we keep questioning assumptions that we have. We consider why and how they get perpetuated and who they're serving and who they're not serving. We need to continue to find evidence and create studies to examine them. And we need to be open to being challenged. I'm open to being challenged on any of these. Some of you raised great questions in the chat. And there's definitely open questions. And especially since all my studies to date have been correlational in terms of like what I'm finding, but it's sending me on a path that's looking for other things. And I think that's the important thing. And that is all I have for this part. And I'll stop sharing and I'll let Zandra figure out, let me know if I need to take questions now, or are we going to wait and go to the other room or what?
Great. So first, thank you. Clap, clap. I'm going to stop the recording